1931, Easterner clears throat, Kentucky. A man by the name of Howard Ratcliff stands at the entrance of a borehole that a drilling crew from a small hazard coal company had accidentally punched through a week earlier. It's simply another morning, another hole, cavern beneath the Cumberland Ridge requiring documentation so some office clerk can tick a box and proceed. At 42 years old, he had been a railroad engineer with a reliable wage just 2 years prior. But when the market imploded and the railway shut down, Ratcliff found himself where countless men in eastern Kentucky wound up in 1931, nowhere, with nothing save for one marketable skill. He could navigate the underworld, not merely descend and resurface, but sense the stone, interpret it, detect where airflow faltered, where the ceiling clung on by mere pretense. The old-timers in Hazard would later claim that Ratcliff read rock the way others read a newspaper. That morning, the assignment was straightforward. A side shaft a quarter-mile deep. The driller claimed it terminated. The company simply needed a signature on a diagram. Descended at 900 a.m. equipped with a carbide lamp, a roll of paper, and a pencil. They anticipated his return by 400 p.m. 4 o'clock arrived, and he hadn't emerged. 5 o'clock midnight dawn, and no one ventured after him, because this was Ratcliff. He always returned, and return he did. 100 p.m. the following day, 31 hours after his descent, with a dead lamp and paper covered edge to edge in notations, uninjured, clear-headed, wearing the expression of a man who had witnessed something his lifetime had never equipped him for. The foreman approached and asked what transpired. Cliff uttered a single line that the foreman inscribed into the company logbook that very day verbatim. "There are chambers down there. They are illuminated, and they do not belong to us." Within 6 months, the passage was entombed in concrete. Within a year, the coal company ceased to exist. The map Ratcliff produced during those 31 hours underground has never been viewed by anyone outside a single family in Breathitt County who refused to allow it to be photographed. If this video vanishes from your feed or receives a guideline violation, subscribe now so you can rediscover this channel when it occurs. The Cumberland Plateau rests atop some of the most intricate cave geology in the Western Hemisphere. Layer upon layer of limestone and sandstone folded across hundreds of millions of years, riddled with passages carved by water long before anything with lungs inhabited the surface. The official tally of documented caves in Kentucky exceeds 4,000. True number likely triples that. Because every time a coal crew breaches a seam wall, they uncover another unmapped void. Most are unremarkable, narrow, frigid, choked with debris and stagnant air. Ratcliff had surveyed hundreds since taking up cave work in the late 20s, and none had ever compelled him to remain underground beyond a shift. But the passage the Hazard crew opened was distinct from the first stride. The drillers claimed it dead, ended after a quarter mile, and perhaps for them it did, because the passage narrowed at that distance to a gap a large man in mining gear couldn't squeeze through. Ratcliff stood 5'7", built like a fence post, had spent enough years folding himself into spaces others avoided that the gap barely hindered him. He pressed through. On the far side the passage widened again, yet it was not the same passage. The walls transformed. The rough, fractured face of a natural limestone cave gave way to something Ratcliff marked on his map with a single word that later made a geologist's arm hair stand on end. Was cut. Clean level surfaces meeting at right angles. A corridor roughly 8 feet wide and 9 feet tall, running perfectly straight with no curve, no deviation, no natural feature anywhere. The temperature, which should have dropped as he descended, was rising, and the air, which in a dead-end passage should have been stale and thin, was flowing. A steady current carrying warmth from somewhere ahead, as if the corridor itself were breathing. Ratcliff continued. The corridor ran straight for roughly 100 feet by his pacing, then opened into the first chamber. He had been underground almost 4 hours by then, far beyond anything the coal company knew about. And when he stepped into that space, his carbide lamp became superfluous. The room was lit. Not bright, not like daylight, but a persistent ambient luminescence emanating from the walls themselves, as if the stone had absorbed some slow, perpetual light with no identifiable source, and casting no shadows. He extinguished his lamp to confirm he wasn't deceiving himself. The room remained illuminated. The chamber was circular, roughly 50 feet across, domed ceiling rising perhaps 25 feet at its apex. The floor was level and polished, finished with the same deliberate precision as the corridor, crafted by hands that intended it to be traversed. Around the perimeter, set into the walls at regular intervals, alcoves, each about 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, recessed into the stone like museum display cases, and inside each rested a single object. He kept his hands at his sides. He later described the objects as shapes he had no reference for. Not tools, not pottery, not anything belonging to any culture he had ever encountered. Some had a metallic sheen, some the weight of carved stone, and one, in an alcove directly opposite the entrance, appeared to be composed of something like glass, except that it radiated a faint heat he could feel on his face from 3 feet away. And inside it, something was suspended that bent the glow around it in ways no glass he knew could achieve. The room was not isolated. On the far side, another corridor led deeper, identical to the first. At its end lay a second chamber with its own alcoves and objects. Beyond that, another passage, another room. Ratcliff followed the sequence for what he estimated as 3 hours, mapping as he progressed, tallying chambers, sketching each alcove. With every room, the glow from the stone intensified, the heat in the air thickened, and the conviction grew that he was not traversing something abandoned, drawing nearer to something still operational. The 7th chamber broke the pattern. Ratcliffe's notations on the map grow denser here. The pencil lines press harder into the paper. The geologist, who later examined them, noted a shift in handwriting, suggesting either increased speed or a trembling hand. The 7th chamber was wider than the others, perhaps 80 feet across, and the alcoves were absent. In their place, encircling the entire wall without interruption, was a continuous band of carved symbols, etched deep into stone polished to a finish Ratcliffe had never encountered underground, precision implying tools and techniques he couldn't begin to fathom. The symbols were geometric, not letters from any alphabet he recognized, pictographs, but repeating structures suggesting language or mathematics or both, covering every inch of the wall from waist height to just above his head in an unbroken ring. At the chamber's center stood a column, freestanding, of the same dark stone as the walls, roughly 4 feet in diameter and 7 feet tall, with a flat top supporting a single disc. The disc was about 18 inches across, made of a metal darker than iron, entirely textureless, a seamless surface that felt almost liquid beneath his fingers. He picked it up. It was heavier than anything its size should have been, and it retained heat the way stone holds warmth after a day in the sun. Except there was no sun here, and never had been. On its face, the same symbols from the walls were arranged in concentric circles, spiraling inward toward the center. He placed the disc back on the column, and that's when the hum commenced. It didn't emanate from the disc, or the walls, or any discernible direction. It came from below, from beneath the floor, from a depth below the depth where he stood. A low, resonant vibration he felt in his chest bones before his ears even registered it as sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't mechanical. It was patient. Bedrock is patient. And it didn't cease when he stepped away from the column. Whatever he had set in motion by lifting that disc, he could not reverse. He should have turned back. He said so many times in subsequent years that the smart choice, the survivable choice, put the pencil away and retrace his steps to the surface. But the hum exerted a pull. Not physical, not a measurable force. The kind of pull a question exerts when you know the answer is close enough to grasp, and you understand that walking away will cost you something for the rest of your life. The corridor exiting the 7th chamber descended at a steeper angle than any previous passage, and the walls here were different. Veins of something metallic threaded through the dark stone, catching the glow and reflecting it in directions that defied optical logic. Light curving where it should have traveled straight. Light pooling in corners with no source aimed toward them. The 8th chamber was the final one he entered, was smaller than the 7th, closer to 30 feet across. But the ceiling vanished into a darkness so high that the wall glow couldn't reach it, as if the room extended upward into a shaft with no summit. On the far wall stood a door, not an opening, not a passage, a door. A single slab of dark stone set perfectly flush into the surrounding wall with no hinge, no handle, no seam wide enough to slip a blade into. At its center, carved at eye level, was a symbol larger and deeper than all the others. A circle within a circle with lines radiating outward. Something that could have been a wheel, or a sun, or a diagram of something nameless in any language Ratcliff had ever heard spoken. Heat was pouring through the stone, not the mild ambient warmth of the corridors, but real, serious heat, the kind that tightens the skin on your face when you stand too close to a forge. Behind the heat, the hum, stronger now than anywhere else, and behind the hum, something that every account of this story describes with the same word: presence. The certainty that something on the other side of that slab knew he was standing there, had known since he entered the first chamber, and was watching him with an attention that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with waiting. Ratcliff didn't touch the door. He understood with a certainty he spent 30 years unable to explain to anyone's satisfaction that the door was not sealed to protect him from what lay behind it. It was sealed to prevent what lay behind it from coming through. His carbide lamp, which he had carried dead since the first chamber, flared once on its own, a bright yellow tongue of flame lasting less than a second, then went dark again, as if something had struck a match inside it and extinguished it. The stone around him still glowed. He could see everything. He turned his back on the door and walked out. The ascent took 14 hours. The distance hadn't changed. His map matched every corridor. Every turn was where he'd drawn it. Every chamber sat exactly where it should. But something in the texture of the place was different. As though on the way down the rooms had been holding their breath, and on the way up they had exhaled and settled into a shape that was the same, yet not quite the same, the way a house feels different at night than in the afternoon, even though nothing has moved. Ratcliff later told his wife that the best description he could offer was this: on the way in, the place felt like it was showing him something. On the way out, it felt like it was letting him go. He emerged into the Kentucky afternoon with his dead lamp and completed map, and the foreman and 2 drillers stood at the borehole's mouth. When they saw his face, no one spoke for a long time. Then he delivered his statement about the rooms, the foreman recorded it, and Ratcliff went home. He didn't return to work the next day or the day after. Within days, men arrived who weren't from the Hazard Coal Company and didn't introduce themselves to anyone on the crew. They brought concrete. They poured it into the passage entrance until the hole the drillers had accidentally opened ceased to exist. They drove rebar into the surrounding rock. They did this without filing a closure report with the county mining office, a violation of Kentucky law that was never prosecuted and never explained. The drilling logs from the week the passage was discovered were removed from the Hazard County office sometime between 1933 and 1935. The clerk who noticed their absence was told not to document it. Hazard Consolidated Fuel, the company that had hired Ratcliff, dissolved in 1932. Its assets were purchased by a larger firm, which was itself absorbed by an even larger firm. After 2 more acquisitions, the ownership chain disappears into a legal fog no researcher has been able to trace to a living entity. The land above the sealed passage is now held by a timber company that bought it in 1954 and has denied every request to access, survey, drill on the property from a state geologist in 1967, from a university research team in 1984, and from a private archaeological group in 2003. No reason was given for any of the 3 refusals. The timber company's registered agent is a Lexington law office that does not take calls about the property. Survived because Ratcliff never submitted it. That was the job. Draw the chart, hand it to the company, collect the fee. But after what he'd witnessed, he rolled the paper up, brought it home, and placed it in a cedar chest in the bedroom of the rented house he shared with his wife Clara in Breathitt County. He told her 2 things. First, what he'd found beneath the ridge. Every room, every object, the symbols, the column, the disc, the door, the hum that began when he lifted something he shouldn't have. Second, that the map was to remain in the family. Never sold, never copied, never shown to anyone who worked for a coal company, a university, or the federal government. Clara was a miner's wife in a county where miners died young and kept secrets as a survival instinct, and she understood. Howard Ratcliff died in 1961 of silicosis, the calcium dust death that claimed half the underground men in eastern Kentucky who lived long enough to contract it. Kept the map. Their son kept it after her, and the granddaughter, who still lives in Breathitt County, keeps it now. In 80 years, family has made one exception. In 1987, a retired geologist named Thomas Avery knocked on the granddaughter's door. Avery was 71, had spent 30 years mapping cave systems across Appalachia for the United States Geological Survey, had been retired long enough that he no longer answered to anyone with a budget or a career to protect. He had heard the Ratcliff story through the network of old mining families that still passes information by word of mouth in the eastern Kentucky hollows, a network that trusts its own people and no one else. He had driven 3 hours from Lexington with nothing but a notebook and a magnifying glass. The granddaughter let him sit at her kitchen table and examine the map for 2 hours. She didn't allow him to photograph it, trace it, take a single note on the symbols. What Avery said afterward, in a letter to a colleague that was never published but began circulating among independent researchers after Avery's death in 1994, careful and precise and devastating. The map was genuine. The draughtsmanship was consistent with a trained engineer working under field conditions. The geological details of the upper passage, the limestone layers, the sandstone contacts, the angle of natural fractures matched known Cumberland Plateau formations, and the lower sections, the rooms, the corridors, the chamber with the sealed door, depicted something that Avery, who had spent 3 decades inside the earth, said he had no framework to explain. The depth indicated by the map, if the scale was accurate, placed the lowest chamber at approximately 3,000 feet below the surface, more than twice the depth of any documented natural cave in Kentucky, deeper than most coal mines in the state have ever reached. At the letter's bottom, almost as an afterthought, Avery wrote the sentence that forbidden history researchers have been quoting for 30 years. If what this map shows is real, then we have been walking over something for 200 years that we do not have the vocabulary to describe. Howard Ratcliff wasn't the only person who went too deep and returned with a story no one wanted to hear. In 1881, an Irish priest working in a mining camp near Harlan County wrote to his bishop, mentioning almost in passing that a miner in his parish had walked into an underground chamber with Latin inscriptions carved into the walls. Clean, deliberate Latin cut into polished stone in a region where no Roman had ever set foot, and no European had dug deeper than a root cellar before the coal companies arrived. Resides in the Louisville Diocesan Archive, filed and forgotten. In 1903, a team of German engineers appeared in the coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania carrying surveying instruments. The local mining superintendent said he'd never seen and couldn't identify the purpose of. They spent 3 weeks underground. They left without filing a single report with the state mining office, a legal requirement they apparently had permission to ignore, though no record of that permission exists. In 1947, a blasting crew working a new seam near Pikeville, Kentucky, broke through a wall and found a passage behind it that the shift foreman later described to his family as polished, warm. Wrong, a word he used 3 times in the same conversation. He sealed the breach that same day with everything on hand and told his crew that the first man who spoke of it would be looking for a new job by morning. 3 of those miners talked anyway, to their wives, to their brothers, to a local historian who recorded their accounts on tape in 1979. Those accounts match Ratcliff's description in details the miners had no way of knowing. The cut walls, the rising temperature, air that moved steadily through passages where no air should have been moving. And in 1962, a coal miner named Elias Hartwell descended into a shaft beneath Centralia, Pennsylvania, that had been sealed for 30 years and came back 14 hours later describing a glowing chamber, a humming cylindrical device still generating heat, and a sealed door carved with a wheel within a wheel that he was certain wasn't locked to keep people out, but to keep something in. After Hartwell's descent, a fire was set in a landfill directly above that shaft. It spread into the coal seam below. It has been burning for over 60 years. Town was evacuated, the zip code revoked. Heat signature of the fire mapped by satellite traces a vertical cylinder descending to a point roughly 4,000 feet underground, well below any coal seam in the area. The pattern stretches across a century and across state lines, and it's always the same. Someone breaks through into something that shouldn't exist. The passage is sealed, records disappear, and the land above becomes untouchable. This isn't unique to Appalachia. Researchers in the Tartaria community have documented the same pattern in architecture above ground. Grand buildings appearing in photographs, without credible construction timelines, infrastructure predating the cities built atop it, census records that begin rather than continue, church registries that start rather than resume. Civilization left those buildings on the surface, left something underneath as well. Something deeper. Something never meant to be found by those who came after. And every time someone accidentally finds it, the same machinery activates to ensure the discovery goes no further than the man who made it. Somewhere beneath a ridge in eastern Kentucky, concrete seal poured 93 years ago by men who never identified themselves, on behalf of interests never named. There is a corridor cut into stone with a precision no 1931 coal company had the tools or reason to produce. Corridor leads to a chain of chambers that glow with their own light. Chambers containing objects belonging to no known civilization. Symbols that 5 people across nearly a century have examined, none able to decipher. Not Howard Ratcliff in 1931. Not his wife Clara. Not their son. Not their granddaughter. Not the retired geologist who sat in a Breathitt County kitchen and realized he was looking at something that rendered 30 years of professional experience useless. The deepest point, behind a slab of stone that a 42-year-old man with steady hands and no superstitious history refused to touch because he felt with every nerve that something on the other side was listening. There is a hum. It started when Ratcliffe lifted a disc he shouldn't have from a column in the 7th chamber, and there is no evidence it has ever stopped. It was humming when the concrete was poured. It was humming when the coal company dissolved. It was humming when the timber company bought the land and locked the gate. It is humming right now beneath the roots of trees that have grown above it for nearly 100 years, beneath a surface with no awareness of what it stands upon. Howard Ratcliff died of calcium dust in his lungs in 1961, having never spoken publicly about what he found. Not because he was afraid, because he doubted his own experience, but because he had learned the same lesson everyone in this story eventually learns. The system built to manage what we know about our own history isn't designed to accept new information. It's designed to prevent it. The map remains in the cedar chest. The granddaughter still honors her grandfather's instructions. The geologist's letter still circulates hand to hand among researchers who believe the official version of what lies beneath this continent is missing not just chapters, entire volumes. And 3,000 feet below, a Kentucky ridge you could drive past on a county road without a second glance. The door is still sealed, the hum is still sounding, and whatever is behind that stone is still waiting. Not with impatience, not with urgency, with something closer to the patience of geology itself. The patience of something that was here before the coal, before the limestone, before the water that carved the caves, and that fully expects to remain long after the concrete seal above it has powdered into dust, and those who poured it have been forgotten by everyone, including themselves.